As a developer who uses Claude Code daily, what strikes me about this isn't the leak itself, but it's that 90% of this 512,000-line codebase is defensive programming. It's essentially trying to make a probabilistic LLM behave deterministically. And there's also unreleased features like KAIROS, which shows where all of this AI coding is heading, where these AI tools are heading. It's not better autocomplete, but it's autonomous agents that dream of your code 24/7. I'm not going to show the actual source code itself because Anthropic is going to DMCA strike me or whatnot, but there has been plenty of people who have already rewritten the leaked code. For example, here we have Clorst. It's a repository where the behaviors of Claude Code are rewritten in Rust. It's not necessarily illegal because this was done in an air-gapped environment, the clean room Rust implementation, as it's called. Here's one of these examples. Here's a pretty much software as a service solution, which is meant for rewriting open source repositories in your own clean room as a service kind of way, where to get around all of the copyright restrictions, this system writes the code, but supposedly it never really sees the actual real code. It's not illegal to take someone's idea, the way it works, take the documentation, API specs, and recreate the code, because you're not blindly carbon copying the code. Pretty much the same thing happened here with Rust. I think there's a Python implementation of Claude Code type behaviors as well. You can find these all over the internet if you're interested in how it works more in depth. Let's very briefly talk about how it happened. So apparently one of the developers included a map file. So it's like a source map file, which is used to deobfuscate the code, because when the code is released to production, it's obfuscated, minimized, so that it would be way more difficult to reverse engineer, especially without having such a source map file. I don't know how the deployment process works in Anthropic, how they release Claude Code, but this map file was probably included by one of the developers who were either publishing this package or it was checked into Git. I'm not sure how otherwise this would end up in a CI/CD pipeline, if there even is one. As I've mentioned previously, chaos ensued afterwards. People started rewriting these clear room implementations. So for example, Claude Code on GitHub. I've already spoken about the Clorust, which is the Rust implementation. Here's this one that seems to be written in Rust as well. I actually thought this was written in Python previously. It must be a different repo. That just goes to show how wild this all got. As soon as the code leaked, people started making their own implementations of it. Surely competitors have already snatched ideas used by Claude Code to improve their own tools. Now to dive a bit more into what we have actually learned from this leak. So we've learned that Claude Code uses a plugin-like tool architecture. Allegedly, there's a base tool definition, which is 29,000 of TypeScript code. We have around 40 tools. There's a query engine, and this engine takes care of all of the LLM API calls, the streaming of the responses, caching, orchestration, and this is by far the largest single module in the codebase. It would make sense if it is the actual brain of the operation. I think we already kind of knew that, but there's multi-agent orchestration. Claude Code can spawn sub-agents. They call them swarms, apparently, to handle complex and parallelizable tasks. In my personal experience, I've done that multiple times. If this is the same thing that I think it is, I've asked Claude to kick off multiple Explore agents at once. For example, I would say, here's a code base, come up with 15 distinct exploration opportunities, list all of that out, and then kick off all of these 15 Explore agents so that they would all go off with their own context and kind of report back to the main agent their findings and summaries. This is probably similar, maybe even deeper than that. I'm not entirely sure. There's a persistent memory system, and it seems like all of that was leaked. Now moving on to the Claude Code Unpacked. So someone very quickly vibed a visualization tool of Claude Code. If we click Start Exploring, you'll essentially notice the 11 steps that Claude takes to go through this whole process. So it all starts with an input. At first, we type in our question, our prompt, into Claude Code, then create user message. Code wraps the text into Anthropic's message format. It makes sense. We need to format it to be sent off to the LLM. This is a very standard practice to put it into a format that is LLM understandable, recognizable. Further on, this message seems to be pushed onto the in-memory conversation array, so its history is appended. Then from Claude MD, a system prompt gets assembled. most likely with all sorts of required tool definitions, context, memory, as you can see, anything that will be useful for serving this query. Further on, we move on to the actual API streaming. All of your text is being sent to the API, and the API is then streaming back the response to Claude Code. Token parsing, let's see what this does. So parse tokens as they arrive, render to terminal live. You see that live tokens came in some sort of a unified textual format that then gets rendered into the Claude Code itself. What about tools? So if tool use finds something that indicates that there's a tool that's going to be used, for example, let me use the bash tool. Bash tool is being called. And then there's the execution loop. What happens here? Collect tool results, append to history, call the API again. So then I would imagine it just keeps going, keeps iterating, going back to the API, calling it again, going through this loop, I suppose, until it decides that the task has been successfully completed. Response rendering. Render the final response with Markdown in the terminal. Markdown is a pretty common format. Pretty much everything uses it nowadays, so that is no surprise. And post-sampling hooks, let's see what that is. Auto-compact if conversation is too long. Extract memories. Run dream mode, not enabled. So this is probably what I mentioned before. It's the KAIROS system. I don't think it's released yet, but post-sampling hooks to me make sense. At the end of the day, just like LLMs can only get so good giving the same amount of data input, the same processing, the same power, same everything, you can only teach it so much. And then we're just improving its capabilities to use different type of tools that can help it, that can assist it. Same way here, we have auto-compacting, memory, dream mode. These are the things that will help it later on in the future in your subsequent queries to actually recall back conversations and keep its context in check. And the final 11th await step, await the next input, back to the read eval print loop, waiting for the next message. And so it begins again after your input. Very interesting, extremely interesting to see into the secret recipe of Claude Code. At the end of the day, this is not some sort of a magical thing. There's an LLM sitting on the other side, except the interfacing with it is different. I'm not sure how Anthropic is going to react to this. I'm not sure if they're going to open source this. We will see over the coming days. What do you think about it? I think the next step for them is just to open source it, unless they're going to rewrite it completely and change everything about how Claude Code works. Otherwise, everyone pretty much knows what the secret sauce is. Maybe people just don't care. It's not like we're going to go and write our own Claude codes, right? I don't know. I guess we'll see on that. Cool. That's about it for this time. See you later.